Hi, I'm New Hampshire State Senator Melanie Levesque. Welcome to our panel, Fired Up and Ready to Go, Black Women and Electoral Politics. I remember as a young girl seeing Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American elected to the United States Congress. In 1972, she ran for president. To my knowledge, there were no other women elevated to the position of running for president, and no African Americans, certainly. Besides my mother, she was one of my most earliest role models who showed me that I could have a seat at the table. In 2004, former Senator and Ambassador Carol Moseley Braun ran for president. New Hampshire has a proud tradition of primaries that allow you to be up close and personal to our presidential candidates. It was an honor to have met Ambassador Carol Moseley Braun in my home. I remember my husband saying, maybe a woman could be president. My journey to the State House was catapulted by rock stars like Shirley Chisholm and Carol Moseley Braun, but also by the Honorable Jackie Witherspoon, who I met at an NAACP meeting. She showed me that I, too, could be a state representative, helping to shape public policy and improve people's lives. But I was also fueled by the legacy of being denied the right to vote and not wanting to go back, but move forward, ensuring that every eligible voter has the ability and the access to voting. Today, I serve as the chair of election law in the New Hampshire State Senate. And voting rights are very personal to me. I continue to be a strong advocate for the people of New Hampshire. As the first African-American senator in New Hampshire, it is an honor to serve my community, but also an opportunity to draw on diverse experiences and advocate for inclusion and change. As Black women legislators, we bring our life's experience to the table. Many of us have experienced discrimination and saw our parents struggle or be discriminated against. And we want better for our children and our future. We're used to hard work and working hard to find solutions. We understand that working collaboratively and relentlessly, turning no's into yeses, are the keys to our success. Another key for me growing up in New Hampshire is to always look for the common bond that we share, but also to value and respect our differences. Sorry about that. Today, we're going to hear from three amazing legislators who are trailblazers in electoral politics. Councilor Andrea Jenkins, Senator Pat Spearman from Nevada, and the Honorable Kiah Morris from Vermont State House. First of all, I'd like to welcome Councilor Jenkins.
Thank you so much, Senator. And hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Jenkins, and I am the Vice President of the Minneapolis City Council. And I hope that everybody is healthy and safe this morning. What a deep honor it is to share space with you and so many brilliant, beautiful Black women. I just want to acknowledge that wherever you are in America, we are on stolen land. And if you are in New England, you might be on Wampanoag, Massachusetts, Nipmuc, Pennicott, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Quinnipiac, or Podunk land. Where I am in Minneapolis, we stand on Dakota and Lakota land. We must also acknowledge that this country, this great democracy, and if you feel the sarcasm, well, what can I say? This country was built on stolen labor. There's a quote from Nicole Hannah-Jones in her 1619 article. Our founding ideals of liberty and equality were false when they were written. Black Americans fought to make them true. Without this struggle, America would have no democracy at all. Nicole Hannah-Jones, that's from 1619. So I do want to just thank all the organizers who put together this amazing conference. I know that it is still as much or maybe even more work than a physical gathering, and the technology issues had come with this, but you guys pulled it off, and so congratulations. And congratulations to all of you who had joined us. You could be many other places on a Saturday morning, but you're here with us. 2020 has been quite a year, am I right? Man, like we could just literally talk about just this week. Losing Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, talk about a woman leading for social and political change. Her legacy will live on for many, many years. And we can only hope and pray that is true. And then the non-verdict in the Breonna Taylor murder was a gut punch, a sucker punch, a TKO for all of us who care about justice, care about equality under the law. We saw yet again the total disregard for Black life, particularly Black women. And Black women have been catching hell in 2022. So far this year, 28 trans people of color have been murdered. Hashtag say their names. Dustin Parker, 25, Nulisa Luciano Ruiz, Yampi Mendez Orocho, 19, Monica Diamond, 34, Lexi, 33, Joanna Metzger, a transgender woman, Serena Angelique Velasquez Ramos, 32 years old, Penelope Diaz Ramirez, a transgender woman, Nina Pop, a Black transgender woman, Helly J. O'Regan, 20 years old, a transgender woman, Tony McDade, a Black transgender man, Dominique Remy Thales, Rhea Milton, a 25-year-old Black transgender woman, Jane Thompson, a 33-year-old white transgender woman, Selena Reyes Hernandez, a 37-year-old transgender woman, Brian Egypt Powers, a 43-year-old Black transgender person, Brayla Stone, a 17-year-old Black transgender girl, Mercy Mack, a 22-year-old Black transgender woman, Shaki Peters, a 27-year-old Black transgender woman, Summer Taylor, a white non-binary person, Marilyn Cazares, a transgender Latina, Dior H. Oba, who sometimes identifies as Tiffany Harris, a Black transgender woman, Huisha D. Hardy, a 22-year-old Black transgender woman, Aja Raquel Roan Spears, who sometimes use the name Rocky Roan, a Black transgender woman, and Ariane Burnett, a Black transgender woman. Many times, the victim's transgender status may have put them at risk, forcing them into unemployment, poverty, homelessness, and/or survival sex work. These are some of the same issues plaguing African American communities, only magnified by one's trans gender identity. These are the issues that brought me to seek elected office. And I have to tell you right now, this is the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. Being a city council member, being an elected official at this time in American history is truly challenging. There is no playbook for this. There aren't any Harvard case studies that include a global pandemic, a colossal failure of a presidency, and the racial reckoning that we are currently experiencing, brought on by the unjust murders of unarmed Black people. But we must be optimistic, right? You must continue to have hope. Earlier this year, when we could still travel, remember that? I went to Syracuse University as the Black History Month speaker. And I met the now famous attorney Benjamin Crump. And maybe I'll say a little bit more about that later. But my host who brought me to campus told me that when speakers come to town, he usually takes them to see the Harriet Tubman House in Auburn, New York. So he asked me if I would like to go. And I'm like, are you kidding? Absolutely, I want to go. Harriet Tubman is and has always been one of my most revered sheroes, a role model and an inspiration. And it just so happened that I had actually watched the movie Harriet on the flight out there. So when I am feeling low or I'm having challenges, get discouraged, I always look to Harriet's lessons for love and leadership and legacy. Lesson number 1, keep the spirit of a leader. Lesson number 2, overcome negative past experiences. 3, learn to survive. 4, have a support system. 5, be able to communicate. 6, recognize on-the-job training, which I'm right in the midst of right now. Lesson number 7, be determined. Lesson number 8, realize the goal with others. Lesson number 9, dedicate your life to your passion. Lesson number 10, believe dreams and predictions can become reality. 11, have a 12, listen and learn. 13, practice financial planning. 14, have faith. 15, stay flexible. 16, volunteer. 17, travel and expand your view of the world. Number 18, learn to tell your story. Lesson number 19, find mentors. Lesson number 20, learn a little bit about politics, which we are all doing right now today. Lesson number 21, network. Number 22, be humble. Number 23, and I'm sure all of my colleagues on this call can tell you this, build a strong team. Lesson number 24, support women. Number 25, bring others up. Lesson number 26, teach others to do for themselves. Lesson number 27, take action when needed. Lesson number 28, be willing to make some sacrifices. Number 29, have courage and don't be afraid to speak up. and lesson number 30, be grateful. So with that, I'm going to yield my time and turn it over to my colleagues, but I look forward to the Q&A after this. Thank you.
Yes, I'm next. Good morning, everyone. I am State Senator Pat Spearman, and I represent the city, most of the city of North Las Vegas in Nevada. I came to politics, my first time in elected office was while I was still in the military. I served as president of the school board in a city in Texas known as San Marcos, Texas. It's right between Austin and San Antonio. I went to that position because I had talked a lot about the importance of education, and also talked a lot about how we need to put more money into education, and we needed to make sure that we were paying our teachers a living wage and not expect them to take a vow of poverty just because they wanted to teach our children. Fast forward to 2012, I retired from the military. My last assignment was at the Pentagon, and moved to Las Vegas, Nevada, North Las Vegas, Nevada. By 2012, I had been here for 7 years, and as Congressman Lewis used to say, was making a lot of good trouble. I received a call in March asking me if I would be willing to run for the state Senate, because the person who had been groomed for that position said he could not win, and if a candidate says that they cannot win, they will not win. It doesn't matter how much money is behind them. Ran for the office, and no one would support me for a couple of reasons. I'm Black. As my former opponent said, no one knew me. And also, I'm a same-gender loving woman. I was only able to raise about $7,000, and my opponent had more than $250,000. And as I said before, no one would give to me, so it was really putting a lot of feet in the street, spending a lot of time on the phone. I carried cards with me everywhere I went. If I was putting gas in my car and someone drove up the pump next to me or behind me, I would turn around, introduce myself, and give them my card and tell them I'm running for Senate. I did the same thing in the grocery stores, stood outside some of the popular places in the mall, and almost looked like I might have been stalking people, but I wasn't. I knew that I had to get my name out there, and I knew that I had to let people know that I was running. The other thing that happened during that time was I kept my strong faith in God. And I believe that's the only thing that really sustained me. I knew that with God on my side, I couldn't lose. I just didn't know by how much we would win. So on June the 10th, 2012, when the results started coming back in, we started off with a 10-point lead with early votes. And as one of the political pundits said, never looked back. At the end of the race, at the end of counting the votes, we were at 67% of the votes, and my opponent was at 39. So I often tell people, don't tell me what God can't do. And we won that race because faith in God, because there were people who had faith in me, and because there were people who were willing to work. So when we talk about fired up and ready to go, a lot of people think that that's where you start. It's where you start in terms of your excitement, but that's not where you start in terms of service. Before doing this, I was working for candidates. I was knocking on doors. I was making phone calls. I was passing out literature. I was doing a number of things. And while I was a pastor, one of the things that I did was I changed our Bible study from Wednesday night to Thursday night, because Wednesday night was the night that the North Las Vegas City Council met. And I wanted us to be there, and I wanted them to see us, and I wanted us to see them. I wanted them to know that there was someone paying attention to what they were doing. I got involved in other ways to make sure that there were policies that were detrimental to our community, to make sure that they didn't pass, and also to make sure that people were aware of what was going on. Since I've been in the legislature, I have been true to what I believe is my calling, my assignment in life. and that is equality and equity. The very first bill that I was blessed to pass was a bill that included transgender persons in the protected class of our hate crimes legislation. That's important because it should have passed the session before I was elected, but didn't, because the person that ran against me is the one who cast the deciding no vote. I was very proud to carry that legislation, and I was very proud because I was able to bring in transgender persons from all walks of life, to include a 7-year-old transgender person who testified with me at the witness table. And as he was talking, there was no one that had a dry eye. And that was important because I needed people to see transgender persons as human. I also knew that while I was testifying, they were also looking at me as a same gender loving woman. They were also looking at me as a Black woman. I couldn't focus on that. I had to focus on the task at hand, but I'm always aware of the fact that when I walk into any room, anywhere, I bring with me all of the baggage of history that is displayed in people's prejudices and in discriminatory acts and discriminatory legislation. I bring with that because when I walk into a room, I walk into the room and you can't help but see my Blackness. I walk into a room and you can't help but see that I'm a woman. I walk into the room and sometimes if I don't tell you, people don't know that I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. So I walk into the room and my very presence challenges everything that we are confronted with today as we look at an administration that is more committed to divisiveness than bringing us together. As we look at an administration that sees the rights of others as just a toy, something you can play with and throw away, an administration that brags, the leader of this administration brags that you can grab women by their private parts. And you know, the thing that is most upsetting about right now is the fact that there are people who allow the occupant of the White House to do that. And I think about that in the context of all of the years that we could have been fighting for freedom, but we were not, because there were people who were unwilling to lay everything on the line for freedom. Harriet Tubman freed, I think it was 1,000 people. And she said, I could have freed a lot more if only they knew they were enslaved. When I look at what's going on today and where Black women stand in terms of social justice and in terms of political expediency, I look at this and I say, this is the time for those of us who have experienced all of the manifestations of discrimination, of misogyny. We are the ones, I believe, that God has called to the forefront because we have a story to tell. So let me just look at it through this lens. I say the things that are happening today are not happening by accident. And wherever you are, I believe that's where God has placed us, and that's where we start. I said recently, as the Nevada State Legislature debated whether or not to pass a bill for mail-in ballots. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle were bringing up a lot of what I consider nonsensical excuses. And I said at the end of the argument, I was granted the opportunity to speak. And I started off saying, I am third generation free. Third generation free. My grandmother was born in the 1880s, barely into freedom. My father was born into freedom. I was born into freedom. But I am the first generation in my family lineage that when I was born, there was an expectation that when I got to voting age, I would be allowed to vote. For my grandmother and my father, that was not necessarily the case. I remember my grandmother talking about the importance of voting, and she would dress up in her Sunday best. She'd have her hat and her gloves and her purse, and she'd be headed out the door, and she would be going to vote. And I asked her one time, I said, other mother, that's what we call her. Other mother, why do you dress up? And why is this so important? Because she went, whether it was raining, whether it was snowing, she went whatever. And she said, you know what? She said, I go to vote every time because I remember at the early part of this century, when I would go to vote, I wasn't sure I was going to be able to. They would ask me how many jelly beans are in the jar, how much does a pot of steam weigh. They would ask me how many monkeys does it take to cover a tree, just anything. And she said it didn't matter what they asked me, I was never going to be able to vote. And at that time, my grandmother was a graduate of college. She had a bachelor's and she had a master's from Columbia University, but she still was not allowed the opportunity to vote. And so I remember those stories and I carry that with me as a socialist, as a social change person, as a social justice person. I carry that with me because I know that I'm standing on the shoulders of people who paved a way for me, and the price for them was great. So I'm standing here, and you know what? Where I am right now, I'm looking at everything around me and I'm saying I'm glad that I am here. A couple of things I want to say. First of all, you may have heard me say that I am a same-gender loving woman. And the reason I caption it like that is because whenever you say sex, people's minds explode. I mean, they can't handle that. And it's not about sexuality. It really is about who you are. I look at the people who have gone before us, like Zora Neale Hurston. I look at Fannie Lou Hamer. I look at a 15-year-old girl who, in March of 1955, Claudette Colvin refused to give up her seat on the bus. But very few people remember her because when she did that, it was perceived as too dangerous to fight. And at 15 years old, indeed, they said she didn't have the same rights. As a person of color, as a woman, one of the things that I want to always, always, always do, and that is look beyond the obvious and learn to think strategically. You have to learn to think strategically because that's the only way you're going to survive. Strategically means that sometimes you look at an object or you look at a goal and you say, I might not be able to get all of that right now, but surely if I work on it little by little, bit by bit, step by step, I will be able to get it. Learning to look at things strategically so that you can build, as my colleague Andrea said, as you can build a community, you can build a coalition. When we start to do this and when we reject the notion that we're in competition with each other, let me say that again. When we reject the notion that we are in competition with each other, that is how not only we survive, but we thrive. Have I been afraid? Many times, many times. But each time fear was about to overtake me, as I said before, I go back and I think about all of those whose shoulders we stand upon. I think about my grandmother. I think about my mother. I think about my dad. I think about my sisters. I think about the people whose lives can be changed if I answer the call at such a time as this. And so for me, being fired up and ready to go means remembering the lessons of the past and remembering there were others who paved the way for me. At this point in history, we are traveling down a road that few who are alive now have ever seen before. But as my bishop, Bishop Flunder, often says, there is no map for where we're going, but we are not lost. And one of the things that is required of everyone who is a pioneer is to keep on going. As Harriet Tubman says, even when you hear the dogs, keep going. When you see the fire, keep going. When you see the lamps, just keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And so I want to say this. I'm not one of those that say we pass the torch from my generation to the next generation. because I believe that the times that we're living in are so dark, we need all of the light we can get. So I won't pass my torch, but I will use my torch to light another torch. And moving together intergenerationally, I believe sooner than later, we will achieve the historic possibilities of free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Fired up, and I'm ready to go. Are you?
Thank you so much, Senator Spearman, for your fiery and so true words. Thank you very much. Next, we have former State Senator Kiah Morris, who will be sharing her experiences at the Vermont State House.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank the organizers of this conference. I want to thank every single person who has been through this process, stayed through these stories, bore witness to all of this incredible wisdom that is just coming at you right now. This is a gift, and I hope that we are all holding on to it and embracing it for what it truly is. So thank you for that introduction. So my name is Kiah Morris, and I am a former state representative from the state of Vermont. I am also the Movement Politics Director for Rights and Democracy on the Vermont side. We also do work on the New Hampshire side. So, but I have a counterpart that does that, who's also equally powerful and amazing, and we are trying to change the face of democracy. So I'd love to begin by sharing some of my thoughts and some of my stories, what's brought me here to this moment in time, what's got me grounded in space and time, and what it's telling us about where we need to go from here. So I also want to join in acknowledging that we're gathered on occupied Indigenous lands, and a reminder of why this is important, and as often as you can to invoke that spirit and to speak truth to that is so key, because the Indigenous blood that was spilt on the sacred ground in the name of God and greed by European invaders, it set the foundation for all of the gross inequalities, the racism, imperialistic and colonial ideologies, genocidal acts, and government-sanctioned violations of human rights that we're actually fighting against each and every day. This is a legacy and living history that continues to be enacted in our names across the globe. And as such, there really shouldn't be much that we're going to talk about today that should be of surprise to you, as it is our shared history. So I'm speaking to you today from Abenaki land. Now, those who are familiar with my work, you also know that I'm not one who's going to shy away from difficult conversations and hard truths. And the reality is that there is an urgency and a lethality to fostering comfortable conversations about the deadly impacts of systemic racism and institutionalized oppression. So we're not going to do that today, right? So that said, it is my pleasure to enter into this dialogue with you. And like so many, I believe strongly in the power of local elections and appointments and in their ability to fundamentally shape the everyday lived experiences of people living in the United States. We often turn our eyes to what's happening in the national conversations and are deeply invested in the narratives that are coming from our federal government about issues of race, inclusion, and citizenry. But what you and I know well is that the policies, the culture, and the bureaucracies of local and state governments are where the abstract becomes concrete, and those visions become realities at rates that are exponentially faster than anything that can be produced from a national system of bureaucracy. So I can't really speak of this dynamic without naming the cyclical moment that we're in that holds rampant racism, xenophobia, bigotry, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, anti-parverty, and markedly ableist moments of political and physical violence that we are immersed in. So what happens in the halls of your state capitals, your school board meetings, and your city councils is but a reflection of the values of our nation and the implementation of an agenda that seeks to maintain power and control over its people by any means necessary. So I see my place in this space is built on the historical foundations laid before me. In June 1964, the members of Mount Zion United Methodist Church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, made the crucial decision that they would become the site of a freedom school. And I don't have to share this history, but I will because it's important to speak it, recognizing that freedom schools were central hubs of learning designed to activate local youth in the resistance movement for racial and civil rights through exceptional education and in training and protest strategies. And they were an integral part of the Freedom Summer activities that promoted mass voter registration and the Freedom Riders nonviolent protests that we all are familiar with. So we knew that there was widespread violent responses to this resistance in the United States. There is always that scientific property of there's always an equal and opposite reaction, right? And so church bombings, acts of terrorism, mass lynchings, grotesque police brutality, they were everyday occurrences. And yet in the depths of the rural South, a community decided to risk it all to do what their faith compelled them to do. So they made the deliberate choice to engage in direct action and fight for the very soul of this nation. In this small church at the end of a dirt road, attended by African Americans who were prepared to stand up and be counted. And in essence, they committed their house of God into a place that would do God's work towards the liberation of all people, knowing fully that their resistance would bring violence in mockery of the light of their faith. My great-grandfather, J.R. Bud Cole, was a deacon at Mount Zion United Methodist Church, and the violence came as expected. A massive convoy of Klansmen looking for white traitors who might be aiding the all-Black church came to that house of worship as they filtered outside at the end of a rather standard church business meeting. The mob forced them out of their cars and beat my great-grandfather nearly to death while his wife Beatrice watched in horror. The men also beat a grandmother and her young grandson who just happened to be there. My great-grandmother dropped to her knees and shouted out fervent prayers to the heavens for the violence to cease. She prayed it was the only thing that she knew to do. She quoted Psalm 88 and shouted to the heavens, "Father, I stretch my hands to thee, no other help I know. If thou withdraw thyself from me, where else can I go?" Stunned, the men stopped the beating. They then proceeded to burn the church down to the ground. Now, in our family, we say that it's my great-grandmother's prayers that made those men cease the violent attempted murder of her husband and the others there. Some days later, my great-grandfather would receive only rudimentary first aid by local doctors, and as a result, became permanently disabled from the injuries with a near total loss of the use of his leg for the rest of his life. Just a few days later, civil rights workers Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andy Goodman were called to Philadelphia to bear witness and to support the investigation into that act of terrorism. My great-grandparents would host them in their home, feed their bodies and spirits, and share their stories of what happened. Shortly after, the Mississippi Klan would gather that night, following a tip in collusion with local police, and those three young men arrest and detain them. A mob would then remove them from the jail and proceed to murder them execution style. The stories of the murders were fictionalized in the movie Mississippi Burning. What this story means for me and what it means for so many Black women is that there are women that we don't often even know the names of who are trailblazers and foremothers, who continue to set the stage for people like me, Black women like me, to claim the spaces that were rightfully ours. We often talk about what happened within that story, but my great-grandmother's voice was one that we only really brought into the forefront as we knew it from the stories that our family would tell. What others that are joining us today may or may not know of my story as well is that my mother, as a single mother of three daughters, trailblazed in her own way the violent resistance to racial desegregation in Illinois to participate in the pivotal Gautreaux housing program that has reshaped housing rights in the United States. She risked it all as a young mother of three girls to try to claim the spaces that she deserves, that are rightfully hers to love and to thrive in the spaces of her choosing. By her acts of courage, she created space for her to thrive and for millions of others who would follow in the years to come to live in the ways of their choosing and not of their conscription. I have the distinct pleasure of being a figure of living history in my state. It was not my intention to do so. It was a calling that was given to me that I responded to. I am the first African-American woman and first person of color to have ever been elected to the Vermont General Assembly out of Bennington County. I was only the second African-American woman to have ever been elected to the legislature in the state's history. And it had been more than a 30-year time span between the first trailblazer. I was able to quickly rise into prominence and power, major influence. And within my second term, we saw the nation turn on its head, moving away from the incredible progress and the things, the hope, the joys, the promises that we felt coming out of the Obama administration into an era of Trump. I would leave the legislature after a almost unceasing campaign of terror and harassment. But my deliberate, calculated departure was not a fleeing and a refugee status. It was at its heart an act of protest and recognizing a state and a system that was completely ill-equipped and patently uninterested in providing what I needed and deserved in exchange for my commitment to serve that state. I saw the growing and pervasive nature of white supremacist campaigns. I know we want to call them movements, but I can't give them the same breath as those that are fighting for collective liberation. I saw the violence reach my doorstep with literal break-ins into our home, threats against our lives. I saw a criminal justice system that was not only directly complicit in enabling that to happen, but encouraging that danger to increase around me. And I saw the impacts on the heart and the spirit of my young Black son. And so I made a choice to say, Vermont, you need to feel the pain of what happens when you do not care for those who are caring for you. When those who step into this space of love, with a love for country, a love for state, a love for community, that choose to not love you back, I was to step away, to find my strength, to strengthen my family, and to come raise hell. Now, it is currently a statewide and national support network that had come through to kind of build reparations for me, to be able to help me be where I am in this moment, transforming the entire face of the way that politics are functioning here in Vermont, and doing the work of my heart to make dramatic changes in the whitest state in the union, and to build the bench for other marginalized folks to step into those seats of power. In my time, and continuing to this day, we were able to pass comprehensive reform to establish an entire task force that looked specifically at racial disparities within our criminal and juvenile justice system. We established a cabinet-level position, first of its kind for our state, for a racial equity director whose job is to oversee and look at and interrogate and challenge the spaces and the places where racial inequities are occurring on the state's name and in our state's government, our state government. We established one of the most comprehensive pre-K through 12 ethnic and social equity in schools bills that also created a beautiful panel of some of the most fantastic and powerful individuals from across the state. The only task force, the only government entity of its kind that is a majority, an overwhelming majority of people of color, BIPOC folks from those of our global majority. We also passed a comprehensive fair and impartial policing bill and are waiting for the governor's signature right now on the most progressive use of force bill against law enforcement you will find in this country. This happened when I stood up and said Black women's lives matter. This happened when people heard those cries and saw the inequities that were taking place. This happened as, while it took a minute for people to say and situate the truth of what was occurring in my life, was happening to their friends, their neighbors, their coworkers, their relatives, and no one was doing anything about it. And so now here we are in this moment. And what my place in the legislature and my place outside of the legislature has done is it's helped me to also take a look at who is always watching you rise. We stand on these shoulders, but there is always someone watching us. And because of that, they say, I can see myself there. So we're gonna try to bring people into this movement. We're gonna come get our folks, right? We need more folks to get this done. But what are the inherent dangers that we have to acknowledge and speak clearly about in this moment of what will continue to become violent resistance against human and social rights? Black women are not simply born for martyrdom. We are not in service or run for office out of a penance. And it is not a privilege to serve. It is our right to have direct representation and not have representation by proxy. So we got to ask ourselves also, how are we going to make sure that these folks will be solvent? Because what we realized as we looked at the great landscape of what I was dealing with is that those dangers are not just for me. They're not just for my immediate family. They're for my mother. They're for my sisters. They're even in my workplace. Yes, believe those white supremacists have even tried to dox my coworkers. They've gone after members and community members and volunteers who have come into this movement to try to threaten their lives and to silence their voices. How are we going to keep Black women safe as we step into these spaces? Because it's not a game and we don't have time. We must also recognize that there are distinct and intentional structural barriers for running for office. And I appreciated the narratives that were being brought forth earlier. I appreciate what was being said because their story is my story, right? Having very little support, next to none, from my political party. And in fact, in some ways, working counter against me in future years. Having only 2 people ever knock on doors with me the entirety of my time. Having about the equivalent of 1.5 staff people the whole experience as I ran in a competitive race, but I won. We can't have that be the future. We cannot ask people to have that experience. We can and we should and we will do better. But we also have to see what are the barriers to full service. So those wanting to run, how are we going to give them safe harbor and protect and support them so that they can govern effectively? I need my Black women to rise up. I need our people of color to step into office. I need our folks from our immigrant and migrant communities to be in those decision-making tables. I need our folks from the disability community to tell those stories that everybody's just now hearing from COVID and make sure that that is at the forefront. So how do we help them govern effectively? Because when they get there, I need y'all to be whole people. I can't have you broken down. That is not what this is about. So we have to change this transactional and this capitalist nature that asks us to lead at all costs in this totally extractive manner. What we're asked to give up, our very health, our families, our rightful claims to rest, to pleasure, and to our individual selves. How do we help those mothers who want to run for office and are going to be asked how they're going to deal with childcare and kids that are in school? In states like New Hampshire and even here in Vermont, you're not compensated in a way that allows for you to be able to work and to do this. You're not given the breadth and the space to govern effectively. And sometimes you're not even given staff. I'll tell you now, I had no staff. I didn't even have an office. I had a Foot Locker and I had a cubby. I didn't even have an intern. But I passed some laws, and every single law I brought forth came forth except for one that the governor vetoed, and that was about holding corporate polluters accountable. So of course, you know, that's environmental racism at work. So this is the work that I am doing of my heart right now. And I'm trying to work with our partners across the nation to change the way that we see electoral politics so that we can get more folks, because this is the time, this is the space. And it may mean that we have to ask some of our most favored and beloved allies to step aside, to make room for those who need to be there. And if they are truly about this movement, that should not be that hard of an ask. I thank you for giving me the space and the time to come with my whole heart on all of this. And I am more than happy to answer any questions when we get to the Q&A, but I want you to just keep these questions at heart, and I want you to take them with you back to wherever you are and to push for the systemic change that's necessary, because we got to do more right now to make it through to the other side. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you, Senator Morris, for your exhilarating enthusiasm and your wise words. We do have a question for you, and that question is, did you achieve the changes through legislative activity or through rights and democracy?
Both. Both. As I said, I stepped in. I stepped in very unapologetically. You'll have to forgive me. I have to plug in my laptop or we're all gonna lose each other. So I'm gonna be moving a little bit in this moment here. But when I stepped into the legislature, I stepped in full on, not even realizing how much I was rooted in my own political courage. And I even took our governor to task in front of our caucus in the second day in office, not realizing, you know, like people were like, you're not supposed to do that. I'm like, yeah, but what he said was garbage. And I have to challenge that. That's not going to work for our people if we like let that stand. We can't let that stand. And that spirit allowed me to continually press in so many of these spaces to make those changes happen. It was not without so much racism that came from in the halls and outside the halls, but we got a lot done. But even once I left the legislature, that was a fascinating part, is that that power stayed with me. And that's that lesson. It never went away. They can't strip that from you. It is in your DNA. It was always there, and I continued to use my voice. And so I've been testifying ever since. We've had people hitting the streets and bringing these things to all of the halls right now. So these changes happened both within that space and external to that space. And so much of it, again, was me saying, like, even though we had a Republican governor, and we still do, his chief of staff will take my phone call. He will take my phone call to this day, because that was never something that was given to me. It was something birthed within me, and I'm going to continue to claim it as much as I need to. So I just want to help others step into activating that for themselves, so that I'm not the only one, nor do they feel like I had to be martyred and removed and now that power's gone. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Thank you, Senator. We also, I'd just like to let you know, if you have any questions, please put your questions in the chat box. And we won't be having a conversation room, but we'll just take the time to have more questions. There is a question, I believe, that Senator Spearman was talking about intergeneration. And we'd like to hear a little bit more about intergeneration.
Thank you. So intergenerational, I think one of the sadistic ways in which people try to marginalize our movements are to make a distinction between the older generation and the younger generation, with words such as, well, that was back in John Lewis's time, and we don't really need that now, or you're too young and, you know, wait your turn. I'm also an ordained minister, and I'm reminded of scripture that says, I call the young because they are able to run, but I call the old because they know the way. And I believe the intergenerational movement that we must have as we move towards equity and equality has got to be one where the older generation is passing on the lessons, the things that have been learned. Tell our younger generation where the landmines are. Share the stories of how you went through, so that they don't have to go through that themselves and they can move on. For example, my sister and I were among the first 15 people to integrate a high school in Alabama in 1969. And it was extremely difficult, extremely difficult. It was difficult because some of the things that happened to us happened under the cover of, quote, this is how we educate. We were constantly subjected to words that demeaned our humanity, such as, after the slaves were free and all of the Negroes had to do this or didn't have to do that. And I sat through that for about 3 weeks, the first 3 weeks of school, and then I said, I'm not doing it anymore. And so when our Alabama history teacher said it again, I raised my hand. He ignored me. I raised my hand again. He ignored me. I stood up and I said, excuse me. I said, I just need to come to the board for a minute. And I picked up the chalk and I said, the word in this book is not Negroes, it's Negroes. And it appears to me that a lot of people in this school have difficulty recognizing that and looking at the letters and they're not able to put phonics to that. So how about this? Black. You can say that, right? Black. It's the same way you would call that crayon that's in the box, black. I was sent to the principal's office more times than not. And the last time that I was sent to the principal's office, the principal said to me, and look, typical, if you can picture a typical redneck, and I hate to use that language, but I just need to frame this picture. If you can picture that, and him sitting me down and telling me, well, now we're just gonna have to expel you for the rest of the year because you just one of them troublemakers, from up the road. We got a different culture down here, and if you're gonna be here, you just gonna have to adjust to it. And so I said, sure, thank you. And as I picked up my books and got ready to leave, I turned around and said, I've been trying to figure out how I can get to Montgomery to work with the SCLC and the NAACP as they press for equality and as they press for more civil rights. And so you just gave me that opportunity, because if you're expelling me, then I don't have to come back to school. And as I got ready to walk through the door, he said, wait a minute. And then he didn't want to expel me. And I was trying to talk him into expelling me. I needed him to expel me because I needed that story. And so I tell that story because so many times today, we have not just older people, we have some younger people who may be afraid of what they might lose. And I always say this, don't be afraid of what you might lose. Look at what you will gain, and not just for yourself, what you will gain for others. The thing that I often say, and I'll share this with you, and it is this: we are writing our legacy while we live. We're writing our legacy while we live. I hope that explains it.
Thank you, Senator Spearman. We have a question, and this is burning on all of our minds. I'd like to ask Councilor Jenkins, how did the George Floyd murder change your city and your work?
Wow. That is an enormous question. It's really interesting. And, I just been listening to my fellow colleagues talk about their experiences, and particularly Kiah. Here we had, prior to the George Floyd murders and the civil unrest that subsequently occurred, we had developed a racial equity division at the city of Minneapolis 3 years ago to really investigate, interrogate every single dollar that we spend to make sure that it is creating equity in our communities. Because Minneapolis, which is a beautiful city, we lead the nation in we have the #1 park system, fantastic libraries, professional sports teams. The University of Minnesota, as you guys are all noticing, is leading the way around coronavirus. Like, this is a beautiful community to live in. However, African Americans, we are, the gap between whites and blacks in the city of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota is the widest gap between blacks and whites in the entire country. So we have been working on this racial equity issue. You guys probably have seen Philando Castile, when he was murdered in his car. That happened right outside of Minneapolis. Jamar Clark was murdered within 61 seconds by the police. And that created an 18-day occupation of a police station. So we had been kind of used to some of these challenges and had been thinking that we were preparing ourselves to be. But when you all watched the former officer Derek Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It not only changed Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota, it has changed the world. People have really woken up to the inhumanity of disrespecting Black life. You know, so myself and my colleagues, after the murder, after the riots, you know, we made a conscious choice to support an effort to defund the police. And let me say what that means to me. Defunding the police means refunding our communities. We know that a major part of why so much trauma and drama and crime and murder happens in our communities. People have lack of access to safe and affordable housing. People have low wage to no wage jobs. Unemployment in Minneapolis mirrors the unemployment across the country. It's always double the amount of white people unemployed. So during this most recent economic boom, when the president talks about how unemployment was so low prior to the pandemic, we had about 3% unemployment for white people and 12% unemployment for Black people. Since the coronavirus, 50% of all working African Americans in our city are out of work. You know, these systemic inequities are so challenging. So since George Floyd's murder, I've passed a resolution to declare racism as a public health crisis. That passed on my council unanimously. And so that now allows us to really focus energy, resources, time, and staff directions towards remedies, solutions, and strategies that lift up Black folks, BIPOC communities. You know, as I mentioned, you know, the Native population here in the Twin Cities is the largest urban Native population in the country. And so we have some real work to do. What I'm working on now is developing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because we have to begin to be honest about what this country has wrought on communities. I started out my earlier comments by naming the land that we stand on and the fact that we are living in a country that was built on stolen labor, that has allowed America to become one of the richest nations in world history. And we have to begin to make amends for that. And so, yeah, number of changes. Our police department has made, and we already had, so we had full body cameras, people, cops, and not only, you know, in some communities, you have to turn on your body camera. We installed body cameras that automatically turn on as soon as they get the call. So, and still, nothing has changed. We have mental health support for our officers, wellness training, psychological evaluations. We've tried all of these different kinds of reforms, and they just are not working. And so we have to completely reimagine what public safety means in our communities. So these are some of the changes that we are trying to bring about as we have been dealing with, the pandemic, the day-to-day. I mean, Minneapolis was on fire, you guys. Entire stretches of our community is burned down. Just earlier this week, myself and the mayor announced a $7 million plan because there are so many small businesses that can't even afford to clean up the rubble from the aftermath. And so, and what was really interesting about it, and we talk about interlopers coming into these communities and wreaking havoc, all of the damage in Minneapolis is primarily impacted businesses of color, communities of color, the Native community, the Latino community, the African American communities. All the banks closed, the banks were burned down. All of our pharmacies in the inner city were hit, grocery stores, and interestingly enough, 3 post offices in communities of color were burned down. And so you gotta wonder, does the fact that 3 post offices were targeted and burned down, and the trucks were destroyed, the buildings was burned down, you gotta, there's no way you cannot assume that this was not contrived. This was not happenstance or accidental. Minnesota is a battleground state. If you can convince 2,000 or 3,000 people to shift their allegiance, the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue can win. And I think this whole thing has been designed to stoke fear and create havoc in our communities. The blatant disregard for human life, shooting Jacob Blake in the back 7 times in Kenosha, Wisconsin, on broad daylight. You're being filmed. Like, they just don't care. I mean, Derek Chauvin looked directly into the camera as people were saying, dude, you're killing him, please stop. And I just for a little point of reference, I look out my window and I can see the intersection of 38th and Chicago, which is where George Floyd was murdered. So I represent this community. I've worked on revitalizing that intersection for the past 20 years. This has been my life's work, and to know that this happened there is heartbreaking. However, we are going to recover. We're going to bring this back. This intersection, we renamed the intersection George Floyd Place. And we are going to create a permanent public memorial, a museum or center for racial healing, which I have been calling for the past 3, ever since I got sworn in. The only thing that's on my whiteboard in my office, Kiah, is to develop a center for racial healing, because our country absolutely must deal with the systemic racism that is literally keeping us all at odds. It's not just killing Black people. It's killing white people, Latinos, people of color. Everybody is suffering from the impacts of racism. So those are some of the things that are different in our community.
Thank you for sharing that. It's so important to get that bird's eye view. You were right there. It's your city. Senator Spearman would like to share a few words as well about her experience. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up in just 1 minute. So Senator Spearman, excuse me.
Okay, I'll be quick. One of the things that I want to emphasize, we've all talked about the ways that we have been involved politically. My challenge is to the rest of the community, you have to get involved as well. I asked a friend of mine in Louisville yesterday, when is the last time you saw lawmakers, either at the federal level or even at the state level, vote on a law that was going to disproportionately and negatively affect older people? You have never seen that, because AARP comes to the table and lawmakers know they are consistent voters. And so we have these things happening in our community because they ain't scared of us. They ain't scared of us. So I always say, hey, look, I'm down for the protest. We can march, we can carry signs, things like that. But my challenge is also, when you organize a protest, before the protest starts, have a voter registration drive right there. That will scare them, because they're not afraid of us marching, because they get tired of us. They're gonna send somebody in with tear gas and rubber bullets and disperse us. So that's number one. The other thing that I would like to say is that there are people right now who, since George Floyd and even before George Floyd, were trying to pass legislation that would rein in some of the military tactics of police. And what you have seen is that police unions organize against people who say there's got to be reform. And so we've got people running for office right now, and they are being attacked by police unions because they've said publicly, Black Lives Matter. We have a congressional representative right now, Susie Lee. She's fighting for her life. And the police union decided to back someone who is an ex-wrestler and has been arrested for domestic violence. And so, you know, Barack Obama didn't say, yes, I can. He said, yes, we can. And so we got to get the we in there, and don't put me out there on a limb and say, oh, Pat, no. You come on out here on the limb with me, or at least put a ladder there so I can get off when I need to. Register and vote. We got to be consistent voters. They ain't scared of us, y'all. That's the problem. They ain't scared of us.
Thank you, Senator. And I have to agree, register to vote, 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 vote. So we're out of time, but I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, and thank you for being rock stars and role models for our young people. Later today, we'll be hearing from the next generation of Black female activists as they move the work forward. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you all for
How
having
do
me.
we contact them?
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody, for this really mind-blowing presentation. And I hope you will stay on for our keynote address speaker that's coming up next. We'll forego the conversation room. It'll give you a little break to get up and maybe get something to eat. And we will start back at exactly 11:54. So we'll see you then, everybody back. Thank you to this panel, and hopefully you'll stay. Oh, I should mention that our closing event will feature Kiah Morris and Andrea Jenkins in ways that you have never seen them before. So Kiah is a spoken word poet, and Andrea Jenkins is a performing artist. So you want to see them in their artistic element as well. So stay with us until then. Thank you.